Have you ever played against an opponent who you knew was making a lot of passive mistakes, but you weren't sure how to actually adapt against them? If you're playing in soft games, this will be a very common scenario, so it's important to know your exploits. In this video, we'll use GTO Wizard AI's node locking feature to build some high-value exploitative strategies. Before we get started with the video, please do go ahead and hit the like and subscribe buttons. It helps us to keep bringing you the best content that we can here on our channel. Thank you. Hi Wizards, I'm Matt Hunt, and today we're going to be talking about exploiting passive opponents. First, let's clarify what we mean by passive opponents, since that's a fairly broad term. There are two main criteria we're applying here. We're going to define a passive opponent as one who is both under-folding and under-aggressing. That means that when facing a bet, they're calling with hands which should fold, and they're also calling with hands which should raise. When not facing a bet, they're checking too much in general and missing both value bets and bluffing opportunities. They're not really capable of value betting thinly, and they have virtually no outright bluffs in their range in most spots. They might bet or raise some of their very strongest draws on the earlier streets, but even that isn't always the case. In general, they're exactly the kind of player you would want to play against, but it might not be that easy to actually figure out the best way to exploit them. That's what we're going to figure out today, looking at how we should play various spots against a stereotypical passive opponent to maximize our EV. But before we proceed, let's also establish the two main kinds of exploits that we're thinking about here: retroactive and preemptive exploits. A retroactive exploit is one where we're adapting to a mistake an opponent already made on an earlier street, or with an earlier action on the current street. For example, if we believe our opponent was underfolding the previous street, their range for arriving at the turn will be wider than it should be, and we can build a strategy for the turn based on that assumption. Importantly, this approach does not make any assumptions about how they'll play on the current street. So in the above scenario, we would be assuming that they would play the turn correctly even after making flop mistakes. Obviously, this is unrealistic, so we have to combine this type of exploit with the other type. Preemptive exploits are aimed at anticipating the mistakes our opponent will make with future actions, either on the current street or future streets. This type of exploit will usually be the most effective way to maximize our EV, but it does carry with it a bigger downside if our assumptions are wrong. For example, if we think they're overfolding the river but they're actually underfolding, or vice versa. It's also very difficult to use solvers to estimate the EV we gain through our opponent's mistakes on future streets, which is why both types of exploits are useful. Even though it's very likely that an opponent who underfolds the flop will end up overfolding at some point on the turn or river, we can't accurately estimate the future value of those turn and river overfolds, since GTO Wizard AI and other solvers don't really work that way, and node locking every possible turn and river runout would be very time-consuming anyway. Our goal is to combine both these types of exploits to build our strategies, but we always have to start with a retroactive approach, taking into account the mistakes our opponent already made, and then subsequently anticipating the ones they're going to make from this point onwards. So with all of this in mind, let me introduce our opponent for the duration of this video, who's going to serve as our example of the classic highly passive player. Wizards, this is Mike. Now, you might look at this picture and think, hey, I think I played with this guy. But Mike is actually not real. He's AI generated. He's 60 years old, American, a recreational poker player, and as you might imagine, Mike plays poker very passively. He only bets and raises for value, he doesn't like to fold pairs or draws, and he's definitely not a winning player. Let's learn how to crush Mike. By the way, apologies to everyone out there whose name is Mike. I just picked the most common American name for men born in the 1960s. I'm sure there are plenty of Mikes out there who play great poker. Let's start by figuring out how to play against Mike on the flop, retroactively exploiting the fact that he likes to call a lot pre-flop. We're going to stick with using MTT ranges and scenarios for these analyses, given that GTO Wizard AI can't yet account for rate considerations in cash game spots, and we're going to keep everything focused on the 50 big blind stack depth, which gives us a flop SPR of around 7 or 8. This SPR would also be fairly applicable to certain highly passive cash game environments, so it serves pretty well for our purposes. We're going to start with a spot where we're in position post-flop in the hijack versus Mike's big blind call, and then move to out of position where we're once again in the hijack, but this time Mike is calling on the button. First, let's look at how Mike's big blind defense range against the hijack open differs from the GTO approach. On the left here, you can see that the GTO range doesn't call pure with a lot of the middling suited hands and weaker offsuit hands. It's 3-betting those at a good rate pre-flop. Mike, on the other hand, never 3-bet bluffs, and only 3-bets 10s plus, ace-queen suited plus, and ace-king off for value. And he calls with almost the entire rest of the deck, except for the absolute worst offsuit hands. After all, he's only facing a small open raise, so he wants to call and try to flop a big hand. In order to analyze the changes in our strategies in these spots, we're going to use a metric called betting volume. Betting volume is essentially a combination of c-bet frequency and c-bet size. It takes all of the c-bets that we use in a given spot, or bets in a given spot, and multiplies the frequencies together to get an overall sense of how much money we're putting into the pot. We're doing this because the changes in ranges from the GTO approach to Mike's approach are going to cause both changes in frequencies and changes in sizing to our c-bets. And the nuances of that are not necessarily something we need to go into in depth right now. We're mostly just looking at how much money are we willing to put into the pot on the flop in various scenarios. So we're going to use betting volume as our metric here and monitor how it changes from one spot to another. So this graphic right here gives us a good sense of how our c-bet volume changes across a variety of different flops. I've got 8 different flops here, starting with ace-king-5 rainbow, ace-ace-6 rainbow, king-10-6 flush draw, queen-7-6 rainbow, jack-7-5 monotone, 10-9-6 flush draw, 8-8-3 rainbow, and 6-5-4 flush draw. Those 8 boards are a pretty good cross-section of the overall nature of flop textures, and as you can see here from the average at the bottom, our betting volume is going up when Mike is in the hand. We're going from 32% in GTO to 37% against Mike. So this is our retroactive exploit for Mike's wide pre-flop calling range. And there's a couple of noteworthy things about these 8 boards. There are some boards that don't really change, and those are the ones where we were already range betting the flop anyway. So for example, the ace-ace-6 rainbow and the king-10-6 flush draw, we were already betting at 100% frequency with a certain sizing, 25% or 39%, and we simply continued doing that against Mike. The queen-7-6 is very interesting because our betting volume goes up massively on that board. We're actually switching from small bets to over bets on that board here, which is partially why that frequency's gone up so high. Mike has a lot of gut shots that we're able to put pressure on, and we're getting a lot more value from our overpairs there with those big bets. Conversely, on the 10-9-6 flush draw, Mike's range now contains more combos of 2 pairs, straights, and hands that contain a lot of equity, pair plus gut shot type hands, flush draw type hands, those types of things. Mike now has a lot of those hands on this texture that he previously didn't have because, as you remember, the middle card suited hands were actually doing a lot of 3-betting in GTO here. When Mike doesn't 3-bet those hands, he now has a lot more gut shots on the queen-7-6, but he has a lot more pairs, 2 pairs, and straights on the 10-9-6. Another board that's changing slightly is the 6-5-4 flush draw. You can see that it was previously the lowest betting volume board of all the 8. Now it's going up slightly because Mike has more overcards and hands that don't interact with this texture that in GTO he's supposed to 3-bet pre-flop, but now he doesn't, and he just has to check fold them on this board. So overall, our frequency is going up by about 5%. It's not massively altering. Some of our sizes are changing, but as a whole, as you can see, we're exploiting Mike's range by going with more c-bets, higher volume, and just generally being more willing to put money into the pot on the flop here. So I'm going to do a short experiment just to wrap up this section. I'm going to go over to GTO Wizard AI and run 5 random boards against Mike's big blind range just to give you a snapshot of how some of these strategies are looking and show you that across the board here, we're really going to be looking at some fairly high aggression levels just based on how wide Mike's range is. So this right here is our first board in the same spot. It's the 8-4 deuce with 2 clubs. And as you can see, the solver actually wants to go with a half pot size here, and it's going to be at a high frequency, almost 90% frequency. So it's actually pretty close to being a range bet for half pot on this low card board. Mike just has a lot of random overcards here that we can deny equity to. Our overpairs are very strong, and if we look at the range breakdown, he still has 37% trash hands, so it's still a very good spot for us, even though it's low cards. He just has so many hands that are weak on this board, and as you can see, we have a very significant nut advantage, 17.6% to 1.7% best hands. So pretty good spot for us here. If we flip the board, we now get a 9-7-5 rainbow. Let's see what we get as a strategy for this one. I have disallowed Mike from donk betting here, so we're not going to see any leads because I imagine Mike's not going to do much leading. And in this spot, we actually are using a full pot size, but about half the time. So again, still a fair amount of aggression. It's just a bigger sizing being used. Again, our overpairs are very strong. And even though Mike can have all the straights, it's still a good spot for us to put some money in. Let's look at board number 3. This one's going to be ace 8 3 2 diamonds. This one I expect to probably be a small bet board, but we shall see. Yep, it is a small bet board. And frequency-wise, we are going to probably come out as a range bet. Yeah, it's a range bet. So range bet for quarter pot here on ace 8 3 is going to work very well. Not really too much need to do anything particularly innovative there. Lots of trash hands. Queen 10-4, all clubs. This is going to be an interesting one. We'll probably see a small bet here, maybe at a fairly high frequency. Oh, okay. So we are going medium bet. We're going about half pot 87% of the time. So it's not too common to see half pot plus on monotone boards, but it does make sense here given that obviously Mike has a lot of offsuit hands, potentially even a lot of offsuit hands that he shouldn't actually have. So we're kind of giving a bad price to some of those low card single club hands. And obviously we're getting a lot of value from some of our stronger hands. And then finally, we will go to the last board here, which is 10-9-8 rainbow. So this is board number 5. And here we're going with the half pot size once again, just because we have a lot of good hands here. And again, it's a high frequency. So a lot of high frequencies here, some range bets even for half pot or bigger, some bigger bets with maybe a 50% frequency or so, but there's not going to be too many boards which come out at low betting frequencies just because Mike's range is so wide that, as you can see, even on a board like this, he has 40% trash hands. So just going to be pretty easy to justify a lot of aggression against Mike here. Going to put him in a lot of tough spots with some big bets and with some smaller range bets on certain boards, but basically we're just going to play pretty aggro. So to summarize our baseline strategy from in position against Mike here, we're retroactively exploiting the fact that he's calling too wide pre-flop by c-betting more often and by being more willing to use larger sizings in the right spots. A lot of boards are going to become range bet boards because our overall range advantage is so significant and Mike has so much trash in his range, while some boards are actually going to become range bets for a half pot sizing or even bigger sometimes, as opposed to just being range bets for quarter pot or less. So really we're going to be able to justify a lot more aggression, bigger sizings on some boards, range betting a lot of boards. Just going to be very favorable for us because Mike has so much garbage that he shouldn't be calling pre-flop. Next, let's shift into looking at our out of position approach. If we once again compare Mike's approach to the GTO range, we can see that the GTO range includes a lot of mixing with many different combos. In fact, very few hands are calling pure in this spot. Mike, however, is calling pure with a ton of different hands, including some which are pure folds at equilibrium, like 8-5 suited or 4-3 suited. He's also only 3-betting with jacks plus and ace-king, so his range is relatively protected by some strong hands like 10s and ace-queen suited, even though this obviously isn't a deliberate effort on his part, it's just a product of his general passiveness. If we look at our c-bet volume changes in this spot, you can see that while there is an overall increase of about 5%, just like there was in the in-position spot, there are actually quite a few spots here where our general level of aggression has not really changed very much and our betting volume has not really altered significantly. There aren't really too many spots like the Queen 7-6 where it went up massively or like the 10-9-6 where it went down massively. Just small tweaks here and there. Maybe the King 10-6, bit of a bigger tweak, but even that is only a 9% difference here. Let's take a look at why this is happening. This right here is the example from the 10-9-6 two-tone board in the out of position spot. In this case, our c-bet frequency has stayed pretty much the same, even decreasing a little bit here. And the main reason for this is that widening our opponent's calling range hasn't actually altered the equity distributions of the spot very much at all. The equity graphs here can show us what I mean by that. On the left here is the graph for the equilibrium spot where we're up against a GTO range. On the right is the graph for when we're playing against Mike. As you can see, the equity distributions are very, very similar, with only a few minor differences between the two. The reason for this is that while adding a bunch more hands to Mike's range did make his range about 50% wider, containing roughly 300 combos compared to roughly 200 in the GTO range, it didn't significantly alter the nature of the range. We added more weak hands, but we also added more strong hands as well. In fact, Mike actually has very slightly more strong hands than a GTO player would in this spot on this board. The trade-off is that because he's flatting a lot more pre-flop in the first place, he's a lot more vulnerable to being squeezed by the players behind him. This is a spot where the multi-way nature of pre-flop play can make the scope of an opponent's mistakes difficult to visualize. It might be easy to think that Mike isn't making a lot of mistakes pre-flop here when you see some of these numbers and these graphs, but he actually is. It's just that we're not the only one who gets to exploit those mistakes. The blinds behind him get to exploit him by squeezing wider and putting us in tough spots with his dead money in the pot. Let's now do the same thing that we did before and run a sample of a few random flops just to see how our out of position strategy is altering against Mike as a whole. We shouldn't see too many massive changes here based on these factors that we've identified. First one that we have here is this King, Queen, Jack, 2 spades. In this spot, we are using a 39% or a 40% really flop sizing here with about 34% frequency. So it's not becoming a drastically aggressive board for us. We are doing some betting, some checking. We're really just targeting all of Mike's pocket pairs, looking to put them in tough spots with some smallish to medium-sized bets here. So nothing really too unexpected about this board. If we look at the next one, it's going to be a King 5 Deuce Rainbow. This board is once again going to be a 40% board, except this time we're betting a little bit more often. Mike has a little bit more of that trash in his range because of the high frequency that he's flatting a lot of those middle card hands, a lot of those broadways. So this becomes a little bit better of a board for us to be able to not necessarily range bet, but bet a little bit more often. You can see that we do have a decent chunk of advantage here in the upper middle portion of the range, and Mike still does have about 28% trash in his range. If we go to the next board, this one's going to be a King 10-3 with 2 hearts. This one is now going to be a big bet board, full pot bet, but only a 25% frequency. So we're really applying max pressure here to some of those gut shots and pair type hands that Mike has. And for the most part, we are doing a lot of checking, again, because he has a lot of hands that interact with this board fairly well. And if we go with the next board, we are doing Ace, King, Deuce with 2 spades. This one is going to be a very good board for our range in terms of nut hands. As you can see, we're using a big bet again, 100% pot. We are quite polarized here, and we're not able to bet that often because Mike does still have plenty of Ace X hands and King X hands that can continue here, but we are able to really apply some pressure there, leveraging this nut advantage that we have. We have 22% or so best hands compared to 14% for him. And finally, if we go with one more board here, it's going to be a King Jack 7 Rainbow. This is actually going to be a very interesting board because this is an overbet board now. This becomes a board where there's so many backdoors, so many gut shots here that Mike can have, that this actually becomes now a really good board for a very big bet, which is a little unusual here, but we're not doing it that often. We're doing it about a third of the time, and range-wise, you can see that we're just leveraging this significant nut advantage that we have here, about 22% to 8%. So there are some unusual strategies coming up here, but we're not able to go with these range bets. We're not able to go with these high frequency, high aggression spots necessarily, because as we identified before, even though the frequency that Mike is calling pre-flop is changing, the overall makeup of his range is not altering massively. And there's obviously going to be a lot of boards where he still has plenty of hands that have decent equity. So that's why we're not necessarily ramping up the aggression that much from out of position against Mike here. So to summarize here, the changes in our strategy when out of position against Mike are a little unpredictable. Overall, we are going to be able to play slightly more aggressively against Mike, but since his pre-flop range isn't quite as restricted to certain types of hands as it previously was, we're going to see some of the boards which were previously really bad for our range become slightly better, and some of the boards which were previously really good for our range become slightly worse. In other words, our c-bet strategy becomes a little bit less sensitive to the exact board, and a bit more sensitive to the fact that Mike simply has a very wide range against which we can attack to some extent even from out of position. Next, let's move on to looking at how we're going to exploit Mike on the flop in a preemptive fashion. In other words, accounting for the mistakes which we expect him to make on the flop itself. From this point on, there's going to be a lot less need for us to separate in position and out of position, since Mike's tendencies are going to be very similar regardless of position, so we're just going to keep things simple for now and focus on in position spots. One noteworthy point to make about playing out of position against Mike, however, is that his general tendency to very rarely bet when checked to is going to give us much more reason to play our strong hands aggressively from out of position, while being less afraid of checking with a capped or vulnerable range, and doing a lot of folding when Mike does bet or raise. As a result, our overall preemptive adaptation to Mike from out of position is going to end up with us playing fairly face-up in most cases, and if we're looking to go beyond that to look for additional exploits, the principles we explore in the in-position spots will still be a solid foundation. So let's start by figuring out a generalized overview of our preemptive flop adaptations against Mike. We've already discussed how Mike is under-aggressing and under-folding, so we're going to assume those two basic parameters for how he plays all flops. And since we're only going to focus on in-position play for this portion of the video, we're just going to look at a standard 50 big blind hijack versus big blind scenario where Mike defends his big blind against our open, as we looked at before. So the first thing to address here is whether or not Mike's tendency to underfold against c-bets could potentially lead us to stop c-betting so aggressively, even once we take into account the wide nature of his pre-flop range. Best way to test that is if we start with a board where we're already range betting. So I've got this ace-ace-6 rainbow board here where we're range betting for quarter pot size, and we're going to node lock Mike's response to see if it makes us want to stop doing that. Now, the response that Mike has at equilibrium here is he's supposed to raise a lot about 20% of the time and call about 20%, and he's actually supposed to fold 60% of the time. And that's one of the reasons why range betting is so effective for us here. What if we have him continue way more than the 40% or so that he's supposed to continue? What if we essentially flip this around and we say he's never going to raise, but maybe he's going to only fold 40% of the time, right? And the way to do this with the node lock, the quickest way I like to do it is just to put everything on fold and then just establish that he's never folding anything in any of these categories of hands. He's not going to fold third pair. We're going to have him not fold any backdoor, any Broadway hands. And then let's also have him call with all of his king 7 plus, just because he has king high and 2 overcards to the 6. And that seems pretty good. We've got a pretty decent frequency in there right now. Overall frequency is at 41% fold. So we've got him calling 60% instead of folding 60%. And he's never raising, but that's pretty reasonable. Now, the final thing we have to do is just lock everything, hit node lock in this bottom right corner, and we should get our result in just a few seconds. And my expectation is we're still going to be range betting, just simply because it's a board that's so good for us. And if he does continue with all these trashy hands, all that's actually going to happen is he's going to end up having to fold the turn a lot more often because he's continuing with a bunch of weak hands. And most importantly, we're not getting raised. So we never get denied our equity. We never get put in tough spots against a raise. We always get to realize equity on the turn, check back, see the river whenever we want. So definitely not going to have to slow down just purely because we're not getting too many folds here. This is going to be a spot where Mike's tendency to peel really wide is going to hurt him. But what about the boards that are not normally range bet boards? Let's take a look. All right, so this next board that I have here is a 9-7-4 monotone all hearts board. So it's kind of a tricky board against a range that we know includes a lot of flushes. And as you can see at equilibrium here, or at least with the retroactive exploit of Mike calling wide pre-flop, we are betting this board about 72% of the time. We're using a half pot size, and obviously we're going to have a robust kind of a checking back range here. We're checking back a lot of 7x, queen 7, 8 7, pocket 6s, 5s, etc. Some ace high. Pretty predictable checking back range for a monotone flop here. Now, I've already run the node lock here to save us some time, so I'm just going to flip over to that. And here on this board, with the node lock in place, we're actually range betting. And the reason is because I have Mike here playing a strategy where he is actually raising all of his 2-pair plus, but he's calling a huge frequency here. He's basically not willing to fold any decent heart, and he's obviously not folding any kind of pair, gut shot, etc. either. And once again, his passiveness, the fact that he's only folding 25% of the time, is actually hurting him here substantially, because it's simply meaning that he's going to end up putting money in the pot and then folding on later streets too much. So even though he's actually putting money in the pot way too often, if we flip over to the equilibrium here, he's only supposed to continue 60% of the time here against half pot. He's supposed to raise 7% of the time, call 52%, fold 41% or so. If we go back to the node lock, he's actually raising more than that 7%. He's raising 8.1%, but it's exclusively value. It's literally only value hands, so we're going to fold a lot to that raise, which we'll talk about later. But generally speaking, he's doing so much passive calling here with a lot of hands that actually aren't strong enough to call. Stuff like Jack 5 with the 5 of hearts. He just doesn't want to fold a heart here. That stuff is getting heavily punished on later streets, and it's going to mean that we actually can bet more often here against Mike's very passive strategy. So overall, when we're not really going to get bluff raised, bluffing from in position is basically a free roll, especially when we're not even betting that big. We're betting, in this case, half pot, in the previous case, quarter pot. We're either going to take the pot down right away, or we're going to realize our equity at a high rate anyway, or we're just going to be able to take the pot down at a high frequency on a later street. The only times we don't realize our equity are when Mike does have a value hand, such as some of those 2 pairs, flushes, etc. on this board, or when he decides to show aggression on the turn or river, in which case, if we're very confident that he's not actually bluffing, then we don't really have to care about realizing our equity because our equity is very low anyway. If Mike is only raising 2 pair plus, then not being able to realize our equity against a range that's really strong doesn't matter because we probably have very low equity one way or the other. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind about the nature of this spot. So in conclusion here, we should actually c-bet more versus Mike from in position, not less, because his lack of raises really fails to punish us at all for our aggression. We realize a lot more equity in bigger pots on average, and bluffing from in position here is basically a free roll because sometimes he folds, and when he doesn't, we get to realize whatever equity we have, which in a lot of these spots is going to be pretty decent. So overall, more aggression, not only for the sake of retroactively exploiting the fact that he's flatting too wide pre-flop, but also preemptively exploiting the fact that he's going to be too passive on the flop and not going to raise enough. The next question that we have to ask here, which is a very important one, is what do we do when Mike raises? Now, this is obviously a tricky question because we've established that Mike is not raising very much, and a lot of the time we're not going to get particularly useful info from people that we don't see raise very often because you have to rely on a rare occurrence of them actually raising in order to see what they're raising with. But if we have confidence that Mike is raising pure value, then our response to that is going to be very important. It's going to have a big bearing on our overall EV. So let's take a look. This is the previous board here that we just looked at, the 974 monotone board. And as you can see, we have that same node lock with Mike only raising basically flushes, sets, and 2 pairs. And let's take a look at what our response versus this raise is going to look like. He raises to 50% pot, basically 3x our bet size, and take a look at that. We have a strategy where we're jamming some hands, which is basically mostly our nut flushes. We are calling with our non-nut flushes in most cases. We're never folding 2 pair here because we still have outs against flushes. We're never folding a set for the same reason. We are almost never folding the nut flush draw, except looks like some combos are just about in that territory where they're thinking about folding. Ace of hearts king is like splitting between jamming and folding. So it's pretty much exactly break even. But if we look at what he's supposed to do against the jam here, we haven't locked this node. So in order to really get the most accurate result here, we actually have to lock his response to the all-in at this point. Because as you can see here, the response has him folding stuff like 9-7 to stay balanced. It has him folding jack-high flushes. That's not really very realistic. So let's finalize the node lock here by making sure that we have an accurate idea of what he's doing. We're going to put everything on call here, and then what we're actually going to do is have him call with all of his flushes. He's going to fold his 2 pairs, and let's actually have him folding his sets. So he's only calling it off with a flush, and he's folding a set. Let's see what that does. So this is the output here from the results that we just gave. And you can see that it's actually fairly straightforward and relatively intuitive in that we are folding a massive amount of the time, which is pretty logical considering how strong his range is. We're getting it in primarily with the nut flush and some of our other strongest flushes. Any queen high flush or better basically, we're getting it in with. We are calling with some of our other flushes. Actually, Queen 6 is not getting it in. Queen 6 of hearts is just calling. King 6 is actually calling a little bit too, which is kind of interesting. As well as Ace 3 and Ace Deuce, presumably because they maybe benefit a little bit more from unblocking certain hands. Interesting. Anyway, the pocket 9s, pocket 7s, pocket 4s, 9-7, all of that stuff is live against a flush, so that stuff is never folding. Aces and kings with the flush draw, they're live enough that they can continue. Even jacks, very small frequency, I guess because it has that straight flush out, is going to have some continuing frequency. 10s, though, does not, which is kind of curious. But bottom line here is it's a very, very tight response. If we get raised, we should fold a lot here. We're snap folding hands like queens with no heart. Even queens with a heart is folding here. And it could be a real error to continue against this raise with a hand like, let's say, aces with no heart. If we look at the EVs here of the different options, continuing with aces, no heart, is losing about 4 big blinds here, which is a big error to make in a pot of only 15 big blinds, 18 big blinds at this point. Yeah, there's 9. Once he puts 9 out there, there's about 18 big blinds in the pot. And if we put that extra 6 bigs to call with aces, no heart, we're getting crushed to the tune of losing 4 big blinds. So very important variable there, that his range just is so strong that we should not be continuing at any significant rate, and we should be very, very cautious about how we call that raise. We're only calling with stuff that's live against flushes, and when we have strong flushes, we're basically just wanting to get it in. So the bottom line here, when it comes to continuing against Mike's raises, is fold a lot. We only really need to continue here when we're drawing live against his value hands, and sometimes that's not even enough. You will find some spots here where even hands that have equity against the value are not going to necessarily have enough implied odds to continue, or potentially the stack depth is not deep enough for us to win more when we actually do win the pot. So in the end, we're actually going to make some really big folds in certain spots. There will be times where if there's enough flushes in their range, for example, even a strong flush draw might want to fold and things like that. So in the end, folding a lot is the only real exploit against these players who mostly just have it when they raise. It's boring, it's not flashy, but you have to be able to do it against these really passive players. So the next question we want to ask is a very interesting one. It's what if Mike is inelastic to our bet sizing on the flop? What if he continues the same range against a big bet that he would against a small bet? This is going to produce some interesting results, so let's take a look at a couple of examples here. So we've gone back to the Ace-6 board here as our primary example, or our first example, and as you can see, I have locked Mike's strategy here against the 25% pot bet into raising any ace or better and calling a lot of those other hands that he was calling before. What I've also done is I've added a 75% pot size. So I've added a second bet sizing option for us here, and I've locked Mike into responding the same way to that size as he is to the smaller bets. So he's got a 3x raise, he's got a call, and he's got a fold. And I've locked the exact same response. So he's completely inelastic to our sizing here. Pause the video for a second, think about what you think the strategy might look like and what might be best in this case to respond to this completely inelastic strategy. And now here's your answer. As you can see, we now are range betting for a big size on Ace-6, which is very counterintuitive. But what this is a very extreme version of what we saw earlier, where Mike is continuing in a very passive way. And if he's doing that against a big bet in the same way as he's doing that against a small bet, it's now going to punish him further for us to be using a large size and then continuing on the later streets, because the pot is going to be bigger. He's still going to be forced to overfold a lot of the later streets. So in fact, when he's inelastic here, we would rather use a bigger size with our whole range instead of the smaller one, which is a very interesting development. I also have one more board where I've done the same thing just to allow us to have a little bit of a different sample here. we've got a Jack 10-5 two-spade board where Mike is raising all of his two-pair or better, and he's not raising his combo draws or anything like that. He's just raising two-pair plus, so it's a very low raising frequency. And in this case, we've got a half pot size and a full pot size. This is the Inelastic strategy that I've locked Mike into here. He's continuing with all of his gut shots, all of his backdoors, all sorts of hands, just not really very willing to fold, just clicking that call button. And he's doing the same thing against full pot as he would against half pot. And take a look at what our strategy is. As you can see, we're not using the half pot anymore. There are some hands that are favoring check at a small rate. There's a 5% checking frequency here, but we're favoring this big bet. We're using this full pot bet, and we're doing it with a lot of hands here. So really, we're focusing in on creating big pots against a very passive opponent who's going to continue with nowhere near enough equity. And we're just looking to maximize the frequency that we can take down that big pot on later streets. So again, Mike is inelastic here. We're using big bets. We're forcing him to continue so that we can take down that bigger pot. So to summarize this section, Mike's inelasticity versus our sizings allows us to bet big a lot more than we usually would do. We're creating bigger pots for later streets, and we're forcing him into positions where he just can't defend his range because it's too weak. We're going to force an overfold on a lot of different runouts, and we're going to maximize the value that we get from the top of our range too by simply getting more money into the pot on the earlier streets to compensate for the fact that Mike isn't going to do the betting for us. He's not going to bluff the later streets enough, and this strategy of bigger bets on the earlier streets helps us to grow the pot and get that money in there when we have two-pair sets, overpairs, etc. So a little bit of a counterintuitive response perhaps, but the inelasticity to sizing is really helping us to size up. So the next question that we have to answer after we've established that Mike's inelasticity on the flop actually helps us is to figure out what we're going to do on the turn after Mike calls, because we've talked a lot about the fact that we're forcing him to continue a wider range. He's continuing way too often without enough equity. But what do we actually do once we get to the turn in a spot like that? Well, what I've done is I've taken the Jack 10-5 flop that we just looked at, and I've looked at that full pot bet and what we do on a few different turn cards. Let's take a look. So this right here is our first turn card. This is the deuce of clubs. This is basically a complete brick. And as you can see, we have a pretty robust betting strategy. We have about a 63% frequency or so. And our value betting region is a little bit surprising. We're actually able to bet for value with some 10x here. This is how wide and how weak Mike's range is. We're betting stuff like Queen 10. We're betting even 10-9 of spades. Stuff like that is betting for value because Mike's range is simply so wide and so weak. At this point, we have a massive nut advantage. We have 33% almost best hands, so almost a third of our range is nut hands at this point. Mike only has 5% because he was raising the flop with all of his two-pair plus, remember? And in this case, he didn't raise the flop. So we're in such a good spot here. We're able to value bet any jack, our stronger 10s, particularly 10x with spades, obviously. And we're also betting a good chunk of our draws. A lot of our strongest combo draws are able to bet. We're able to bet with a lot of flush draws. We've got some open-enders in there as well. Just a lot of our most robust drawing hands. Plus, if we look at the weaker hands that are betting here, we're able to actually just blast off with hands like King 7 of hearts, King 7 of diamonds, Queen 6 of clubs, 8-7 for the low-end gut shot, 7-6 of hearts, 7 high with no real equity here. We're able to blast off with these hands, not just because we need to have bluffs, but because Mike's range is so weak for getting to this spot that we're simply in a situation where he cannot defend very effectively. He's going to be forced to fold a lot here. So we're able to value bet thinner, and we're able to bluff with quite a variety of hands, including a lot of pretty weak hands that usually might not be very good bluff combos on this turn card. If we look at a different turn card here, maybe we put up a turn card that completes a lot of draws. Maybe we put up something like a 9 of spades, which completes the straight and the flush. This is going to be obviously a very different kind of a spot. And in theory, we still have Mike checking everything here. There's no real necessity for him to be donk betting here. His range just isn't strong enough to warrant doing that. But if we look at what our strategy now is, we actually have a smaller size. So once again, we're using a fairly aggressive approach we're just not necessarily polarizing in the same way that we would on a brick. So we were using the 2/3 pot size on the deuce turn. We're now using 40% here. The pot is already pretty big. There's 18 bigs out there because we bet full pot on the flop. So we don't necessarily have to go with these overly polarizing sizes. We can use these moderate 2/3, 40% kind of sizes. And as you can see here, we're able to continue value betting pretty liberally. We've got still some chunks of 10x that are value betting. Stuff like Queen 10 is value betting here. We still have even some 9x that's betting, which is sort of a bit mergy here, kind of a bluff, but not really that much of a bluff, I guess. We are still doing pretty well with 9x. And if we look at the bluffing region, it is obviously going to be some pretty trashy stuff, some ace 8 with just an 8 for an open-ender, the low open-ender. But then we've got some stuff like 8-6, which is even weaker than that. We've got 7-6, 6-5, again, some pretty weak stuff. And we're also turning some pocket pairs into a bluff as well. So we're able to continue quite aggressively once again. We're just not using quite the same kind of a size. If we look at the range breakdown, Mike does have a decent chunk of flushes now, 12% best hands instead of the 3% that he had in the previous spot. So we are a little bit more cautious, but because his range is still very wide, he still has 35% trash hands. We still do get to play relatively aggressively. So not a spot where we have to massively slow down. If we now shift back to looking at the ace-6 rainbow spot, what I have here is a version of this sim where I've locked Mike to always check raise an ace on the flop and never call with anything an ace or better. So he's actually extraordinarily capped in the range that he continues versus the small bet here. We've eliminated the large bet here just for simplicity. We're not necessarily going to worry about the inelasticity here. We're just looking at what happens purely if he continues with that very capped range. And as you can see on this deuce turn, he's so capped that we're now going with a big overbet. We're going with this 116% of pot, and we're actually doing it with our entire range, or virtually our entire range. So this is a spot that is so favorable for us. We have almost 40% best hands, and he has 0.7. He literally only has one full house, which is deuces. So if he's raising every single ace here, we get to blast off with complete impunity with virtually everything. This is an obviously very extreme example, but this is a good sort of guideline here of if you really feel like when he calls here, he just never has an ace. Maybe it's a live game and you have a live tell sort of a thing going on. Maybe you just feel like you know exactly how this guy plays and he just always raises the flop if he has an ace and you bet small. This is what you can do. You can pound in a big bet with every single hand. So pretty extreme adaptation, but a good guideline of what these exploits actually look like against these super passive players who only raise value. So to wrap up this section, as you could see from these examples, on brick turns, we get to blast off a lot. We get to use some big sizes, especially when Mike is extremely capped. These turn cards allow us to put in a lot of money here. The betting volume is going to be very high. And even though the non-bricks are going to require a little bit more nuance, we're going to have to be a bit more structured in how we bet. And maybe we don't use quite such big sizes because he's going to be a little bit less capped. We are still going to be able to show a good degree of aggression. And no matter what here, the overall weakness of his range, even if it isn't that capped, he's going to struggle to defend it. You saw that even on the turn card where he could have a lot of flushes and some straights, we still were able to show about 63% or so aggression. We were betting quite often there. So it's not going to be that we're going to have to slow down a lot. It's just really going to moderate our sizing a little bit more so than our actual frequency. So the next question we're going to have to ask here is, does the river function the same way as the turn? What if Mike is continuing beyond the turn with way too many hands? What if he just doesn't want to fold a draw? And maybe the only stuff that he folds on the turn is going to be the stuff that didn't get that backdoor draw that he was looking for. Well, let's find out. So the example that we're going to use here is this Jack 10-5. Once again, in this case, we bet full pot on the flop and Mike calls. We're going to get that deuce of clubs blank turn. He's going to check. We're going to use this 2/3 pot sizing. And I'm going to walk you through the node lock that we're going to implement here for Mike's range. When we bet, we're going to have him pretty much jam anything that still has, or that has just turned 2-pair plus. So we're going to go right here And we're going to, first of all, just set everything on fold, just for simplicity. And then we're going to go straight to the jam. And we're going to say if he has a set, which is deuces, the only set he can have. If he has 2 pair, he's going to check jam. That's all we're going to do. We're never going to have him check jamming with a bluff because, as we've seen, he's the most passive player ever. We're going to have him always call his top pair, always call his second pair, always call his third pair because he doesn't like to fold pairs, remember. Low pair, he's even going to call 4s and 3s here because maybe he just thinks we have a draw. And then we're going to have him call any combo draw, any nut flush draw, any flush draw, although we're going to have to go back to that flush draw that also has 2 pair, any open-ender, and any gut shot. So we're really only going to have him fold the stuff that has no pair, no draw, essentially. And he's going to continue everything else. So let's node lock, and we will see what happens. And this is our new strategy right here. What you'll see is that it's become a little bit more linear. If you focus your energy on this equity buckets breakdown down here, you can see that there's kind of a linearness to where the edges of these categories are. I like to use this as a pretty good guideline here. If we look at a polarized range would be that we would have our best hands betting at a higher frequency, our trash hands betting at a higher frequency, and our good hands and our weak hands betting a bit less often, right? We might see a bit more of a curve to it. We might see something like that, right? But a less polarized range, a more linear range, is going to look a bit more like that. It's obviously there's a little bit of a trend there, a little bit of a curve, but for the most part, our range is a bit more linear. And that's simply because we're not getting raised very much. We don't have to fear the raise. We don't have to worry about what do we do against a check jam. We're just able to bet a lot more linearly. And as you can see, almost any second pair now is a pure value bet. We're betting 2/3 pot here with almost any 10x, 10-7, 10-9, 10-8, although 10-8 is checking a fair amount depending on the combo. But we're even betting for value with 8s, 7s, 6s, 5s, because those hands, well, 5s is a set actually, so forget about 5s. But we're betting 8s, 7s, and 6s here, and we're getting value from worse hands. We're getting called by any pair, remember. So we just have to be very, very willing to value bet super thinly in this spot. This is the essence of these situations. Most of you, if you are having trouble against these very passive players, it's probably going to be because you're not appropriately adjusting your value ranges. It's not possible for someone to be drastically underfolding, but also doing it with the right range of hands. They have to be underfolding with specifically hands that are too weak to continue. And that's what allows us here to get value from stuff like a 10, Queen 10, 10-9, stuff like that. We're going for value every time here with stuff like Jack 9, Jack 8 even. Jack 7 is kind of close. Jack 7 of hearts looks like it wants to check back here, but we're really getting a ton of value from a lot of these hands, and we're continuing to go for it with a lot of our draws. We're betting most of our combo draws here, most of our flush draws, most of our open-enders. We're not checking that many of them. We're just realizing equity a lot of the time here because we get called and then we see a river, or we simply get a fold and we take the pot down right now. This is the first part of the equation, that we're betting the turn as a preemptive exploit here. We're betting the turn with a much more linear range. So the question was, how does the river function? What's the difference here? And does it function the same way? Well, let's take a look. Once Mike calls, let's imagine we get another brick now on the river. Maybe we get another deuce. Maybe we get the deuce of diamonds. And we know Mike never has a full house because he always raises 2 pair plus on the turn. Now, it does want villain to lead out at some frequency. It does want Mike to lead in this spot, but let's assume that that's not going to happen. Let's actually get rid of his option to lead here, because realistically, probably pretty unlikely that he's going to find some of these weird bluffs, or probably pretty unlikely he's going to find some of these blocker bets with a jack or anything like that. So we're just going to have him check everything. And now, with about a 2/3 pot bet behind, we actually have a very simple river strategy. We're going for pure value with every top pair plus, right? On a brick river, we are jamming every single jack or better. It's clearly strong enough to bet here. And we're also bluffing with pretty much all of our king high or worse, except for king queen specifically, and a little bit of king 9 that we're checking back because we do have a tiny bit of showdown value with those hands. But in fact, It's actually a very, very simple strategy to execute here on a brick. It's not difficult at all to employ this approach. We can establish very clearly that Jack X is our value threshold. We're betting everything Jack X or better, and we are bluffing with pretty much everything King 9 or worse. And that's a really clear and easy blueprint and rubric that we can follow here. Not going to be difficult to employ that strategy. We have no reason to bet 40% here because there's nothing in this range that has incentive to do that. However, even if we were to just get rid of that 40% here, just for simplicity, what we will see when we come to look at Mike's bluff catching protocols is that we might have to make some adaptations based on what he actually does on this river. So this is a retroactive exploit on the river of this very straightforward polarized range where we bet all in for 2/3 pot with a jack or better and with bluffs, but we may find that we can do some preemptive exploiting here, which we'll talk about in a second. So to draw some conclusions here, we saw that betting the turn linearly worked very well for us, given that we can preemptively assume Mike is going to play the turn very passively. We got a lot of thin value from our second pair hands here. We weren't as polar as we usually would be. And from there, the river is actually going to function fairly simply. We're mostly going to be able to go for value on a lot of brick runouts with top pair plus. And on some non-brick runouts, there is going to be some nuance there. But the fact that we are betting the turn fairly linearly is going to mean that for the most part on the non-brick runouts, we're still going to retain a lot of the draws that get there. We obviously bet for value with those draws. We have certain other hands that are going to usually be missed draws that are going to be able to bluff. So in general, our range selection processes are not going to be that much more complicated on bricks. The general idea here is we're going linear on the turn, and then as we move into the river, the same principles are going to apply. It's going to be very difficult for villain to defend on the river, and as a result, we're going to be able to employ these polarized river strategies in a fairly simple way. The final question for us to answer here when it comes to Mike's tendency to underfold is going to be, what if he doesn't fold his bluff catchers? What if we get to the river, it's a brick run out, and he just simply refuses to fold anything that catches bluffs? Well, you might imagine that the result here might be a little bit self-explanatory, that it might be a little bit simple, but let's check in just in case. Okay, so this is our spot that we were just looking at where we had that linear turn bet, and we are then arriving at the river with this deuce of diamonds brick, and obviously both players have some missed draws here. Both players have some decently strong hands, but clearly we have a lot more strong hands than Mike does. So let's take a look at what happens if Mike doesn't fold his bluff catchers. We're going to go with this 2/3 pot all-in range here. This is the reason why I used 50 big blinds, because we're shoving the river for not that big of a bet size. And you can see that Mike actually does have a couple of hands that make trips here, because he was continuing beyond the turn with all of his deuce X. But the key question here is, what happens if he doesn't fold his bluff catchers? So to figure that out, we have to establish which hands actually count as bluff catchers here. Now, theoretically, as you can see, ace high is actually supposed to call sometimes here. Ace high, as you can look at here, is going to call about half the time because ace high actually beats a lot of our bluffs. But probably pretty reasonable that Mike won't be able to identify that ace high might actually be good here. So we're going to establish his bluff catchers as being anything one pair or better, basically here. So that's going to be 3s, 4s, 6s, 7s, 8s, etc. All that stuff, 10x, jack x, etc. But he's going to fold his ace highs, he's going to fold ace queen, stuff like that. So let's lock that in there. This hopefully should be pretty easy. Once again, the way I do these node locks is just put everything on fold and then just simply go to the hand categories. We go trips, top pair, second pair, third pair. Oops, second pair didn't go. There we go. Low pair. And that is it right there. So we're betting the river for 2/3 pot. To finalize it, we hit lock all once again, and everything is in place. In fact, what's interesting here is that some of these hands are weak enough that he's actually calling with some of these trash hands, right? You can see there that he's calling, a decent chunk of his hands that are actually pretty weak. He's calling 2/3 of the time, folding the rest here. And our strategy is going to shape up as follows. Take a look at that. What do you notice? Hopefully, if you just take a few seconds to look at this breakdown, the outcome is becoming fairly apparent here. we're not bluffing. We're not bluffing at all. We have no bluffs whatsoever. And not only that, but take a look at 10x. We're now jamming all of our 10x for value. 10-7, 10-9, 10-8, etc. There are simply so many hands that we beat that a hand like 10-7, if we look at the equity here, 10-7 at this point has 68% equity. And that is a very strong hand. It's a hand that's strong enough to get called by worse at a decent rate. So even if we are running into a deuce occasionally here, because Mike can call the turn with any deuce, even if we're running into a jack, we're getting enough value that we can jam 10x. And EV-wise, it's not going to be especially close. If we look at things EV-wise here, even though there is a fairly close margin between jamming and checking, 10x is simply winning the pot such a high rate here that we're actually making 29 big blinds one way or the other. So it's not mandatory to jam a 10 here, but take a look at something like a jack. Jack 7. Jack 7 here, there's about a 10 big blind difference between jamming and checking. So the really important thing to identify here is it's not about really finding some kind of bluffs here. We don't have to have bluffs, as we saw. Mike is underfolding to our river aggression, so it's not important that we find bluffs. What is important is that we have to jam a jack for value. If you check back with a jack here, you're missing so much value from these passive players. And a lot of you that might be having trouble here could be having trouble because you're not jamming a jack for value in this spot. So very important to recognize how strong a jack is in this situation. Conversely, part of the reason why we're not bluffing with certain hands is take a look at something like ace 3. Ace 3 of diamonds, let's say, which is a busted gut shot here. We missed the gut shot on the turn. This hand is not bluffing, not only because Mike is underfolding here and the bluff is losing 4 big blinds, but we win 13 big blinds or so by checking here with ace 3 of diamonds because we have good showdown value. We win this pot quite a bit. Even queen 6 here, queen 6 of hearts, queen 6 of clubs, we're winning about 7.5 big blinds or more by checking down because Mike's range is so weak that we don't need to bluff with queen high anymore. In fact, even 7-6, even 7 high here is actually capturing 1 big blind from this pot because sometimes Mike just has 4-3 of spades or something like that, and we actually win with 7 high. So that's another reason why we're not bluffing here. It's not just because Mike refuses to fold. It's because the hands that would usually bluff because they have no showdown value now have some showdown value. They have some equity. They win the pot a small frequency at a time at showdown. And it becomes very important to make sure that we capture that by just checking and taking that small portion of the pot here instead of turning our king highs, our queen highs into a bluff and not only making an unprofitable bluff, but also wasting the opportunity to just check and realize that equity that we do have. Especially hands like ace-king here. I mean, ace-king is making 14 big blinds checking back, right? So we absolutely don't want to miss those checkbacks the same way we don't want to miss those value bets. So that kind of sums it up for this river spot. Let's bring it back around and draw some conclusions. So to summarize our approach here, we have to be very willing to value bet thinly on the river. A 10 in this spot on Jack 10, 5, deuce, deuce would be a very good value candidate. And we really don't have very much need to bluff anymore if we're going to find our opponent underfolding. It's going to turn our break-even bluff candidates into losing bluff candidates. And crucially, our bluff candidates are also going to have some showdown value here. A lot of our king highs and queen highs on this brick river are actually going to sometimes win. And we don't want to waste that showdown value by betting in a potentially unprofitable spot when we might actually be able to capture 5, 10, 15% of the pot even by simply checking and hoping that Mike happens to have a worse draw that missed. So that's a very important concept to keep in mind. So with that said, let's draw some overall conclusions from this video about how we're going to crush Mike and players like Mike going forward. Our EV versus these passive players is going to come from growing pots with our value hands It's going to come from linear range construction, where we're betting our strongest hands, our strongest draws. We're going for thin value in a lot of spots. We're not going as polar, and we're recognizing that they're going to continue with a lot of hands that don't have enough equity, which means that larger early street sizings are going to be very effective, especially in situations where they're very inelastic to our size. But when they do raise or show some kind of aggression, we have to be very, very tight. We have to be folding some pretty big hands and mostly just continuing with stuff that's actually live against the value portions of their range, because their range is going to be mostly value, and we don't want to be trying to bluff catch against those ranges. Finally, we don't really have to bluff rivers against them very much, especially when our bluffs sometimes win. Now, if we did find a spot where a particular player was continuing to the river a lot and then folding, or perhaps on some of those river cards that are not complete bricks like that deuce that we looked at, the opposite cards like a 9, an 8, for example, something like that, those cards, we might still have some bluffs, especially if we think that maybe they're going to be a bit more likely to fold some of the pair hands that get to that point. But when rivers brick off and our bluffs have some equity to win at showdown, we really don't often have to bluff rivers against these players, especially if we just simply don't think they're going to fold. So that's a really crucial adaptation to make as well. In general, you're going to find a lot of these players at all stake levels, even up to high stakes. These players do exist. Obviously, Mike is a pretty extreme example. We saw he was really unwilling to fold any of those gut shots or any equity at all. But this general principle of linear equity, growing pots on early streets, that's going to be very useful against all of these passive opponents that you're going to come up against. So keep that in mind going forward. If you have any questions at all about the content of this video, I will be available on the GTO Wizard Discord server. Just feel free to tag me or send me a message there. I'll be happy to discuss the content. Otherwise, thanks everybody for watching. I will be back again soon with more video content, and I hope you guys can put this content into practice at the tables. Good luck. I'll see you soon.